The portrait arrived on a rain-swollen afternoon, its frame wrapped in the brittle twine and brown paper of estate clearance. I hadn't asked for it, hadn't even known it existed, yet there it was on my doorstep, two pale sisters in starched dresses, their hands folded neatly in their laps as if waiting to be called for supper. At first glance it was harmless, even quaint, the sort of ancestral relic families keep out of obligation rather than affection. But the moment I lifted away the paper and met the girls' eyes, something inside me faltered. It wasn't that they stared too intensely, nor that their identical expressions seemed rehearsed. It was something quieter, something that stirred like a draft at the back of a locked room. Their eyes did not quite align with the faces that held them. They were too sharp, too alert, painted with a precision that felt out of time with the rest of the portrait's cracked, fading strokes. And as the light shifted across the glass, I could swear the left sister's gaze moved, just slightly, as though adjusting to get a better look at me. I set the portrait against the wall, meaning to deal with it later, but as I walked away, the unease stayed with me, trailing after me like footsteps I couldn't hear but somehow felt. There was something wrong with those eyes. They didn't observe so much as wait, knowing, patient, and unbearably present. Key point number 1 begins the moment the protagonist encounters the portrait, a seemingly harmless relic from a distant branch of the family tree, yet it immediately carries an air of displacement, as though it does not belong in the world it has re-entered. The portrait arrives without warning, with no accompanying note beyond the estate tag tied to its frame, and the protagonist feels an odd reluctance to touch it at first, sensing a quiet weight that has nothing to do with the wood or the canvas. When the wrapping is finally peeled back, the painting reveals itself in stages, the ornate Victorian frame, chipped at the corners, the muted sepia tones that suggest a long-closed parlor room, and then the sisters themselves, sitting rigidly beside one another. Their posture is formal, hands clasped in identical positions, dresses pressed and immaculate, yet something about their stillness is unsettling from the very beginning. The protagonist tries to rationalize this discomfort, reminding themselves that old portraits often appear stiff or eerie due to the style of the time, but this explanation does little to settle the faint tension creeping up their spine. The girls' faces are delicate, youthful, and composed, their expressions neutral enough to avoid immediate suspicion, yet a strange familiarity seems to linger in their features, as though the protagonist has seen them before in some half-forgotten dream or shadowy memory. The room seems to grow quieter the longer the protagonist looks, as if the air itself is listening. At first it's all dismissed as imagination. The portrait is old, the weather outside is dreary, and the house is full of the peculiar silence that settles after a long rain. But there's something about the eyes. They don't strike the protagonist as frightening at first, only unusually vivid for their age. The paint appears more vibrant, as though the color has not faded like the rest of the canvas. The girls' pupils are small, precise, and almost glassy, reflecting the dim light in a way that makes them appear deeper, darker, more aware. The protagonist leans closer, unsure whether the effect is due to the artist's skill or something else entirely. As the protagonist steps back, the sensation of being observed becomes more distinct, a pressure between the shoulder blades that doesn't fade even when they turn away from the portrait. They carry it with them into the next room, a subtle yet persistent feeling that the eyes of the two sisters remain fixed on them, memorizing their movements, quietly acknowledging their arrival after so many forgotten years. The first shift is so slight the protagonist almost convinces themselves it never happened. They return to the room where the portrait has been set against the wall, planning to move it to a storage closet, and for a heartbeat they feel certain the sisters' eyes are angled a little differently than before. The right sister, whose gaze had originally seemed fixed just left of center, now appears to be staring directly at the doorway. The protagonist blinks, steps closer, and tells themselves they must be misremembering. Old images can play tricks on the mind, especially when one is already uneasy. But something about the portrait's expression feels altered, as though the girls have shifted their attention in the protagonist's brief absence. The idea is dismissed, tucked away with all the other small discomforts the painting has inspired, yet it lingers like a low hum beneath the surface of rational thought. Over the next few days, the subtle disturbances continue. Whenever the protagonist enters the room, a faint sensation of being watched prickles their skin. It grows stronger when they walk past the portrait, as though the sisters are tracking each movement with cold, deliberate patience. Eventually, the protagonist begins to avoid looking at the painting directly, choosing instead to glance from the corner of their eye, hoping to catch the exact moment the illusion occurs. Yet each time they attempt to observe it, the image remains perfectly still, locked in its century-old posture. Still, the feeling persists, an almost physical presence pressing quietly against the edges of their awareness. One afternoon, a sliver of late-day sunlight strikes the portrait at an angle that illuminates the eyes with an uncanny brightness. The protagonist notices something impossible: one of the pupils is no longer perfectly round. Instead, it appears slightly elongated, as if caught mid-adjustment. The protagonist's hands grow cold. They lean in, searching for evidence of cracking, retouching, anything that might explain the distortion. But the paint is smooth, unbroken, and disturbingly lifelike. When they lean back, the pupil looks normal again, perfectly shaped, leaving the protagonist unsure whether it was ever altered at all. As night falls, the changes become even harder to dismiss. Passing the room in the dark, the protagonist glimpses the faint gleam of eyes seeming to follow the movement in the hallway. It's subtle, no more than a flicker, but enough to disrupt sleep, enough to plant the unsettling thought that the sisters are no longer confined to the painted world behind the glass. Their gazes seem to acknowledge the protagonist now, as though recognizing them, studying them, waiting for something the protagonist has not yet begun to understand. The growing unease eventually pushes the protagonist toward research, a task they undertake reluctantly at first, unsure what they expect to find. The portrait bears no signature on the front, only a faint, dust-coat mark on the back of the canvas, a name half-faded, the year 1897, and a small emblem resembling an eye etched into the wood. The symbol unsettles the protagonist more than the date or the name, but it also stirs an unwilling curiosity. They begin searching through old archives, estate records, and forgotten corners of local history, hoping for a mundane explanation that might quiet the unease tightening around their thoughts. The first discoveries seem harmless enough. The portrait originally belonged to a family whose name no longer appears in town registries. The two girls, identified only as Clara and Eleanor, vanished shortly after the year the painting was completed. The records do not specify how or why. There are no police notes, no newspaper clippings explaining what happened. The town at the time was small and reclusive, and the disappearance of children was folded into rumor long before it reached the level of official concern. Whispers from the era suggest the family had fallen under some odd influence, though the nature of that influence is never clearly documented. It's all vague, fragmented, and unsatisfying, yet the lack of clarity is what begins to trouble the protagonist most. The deeper the research goes, the more the name of the portrait's creator surfaces in unsettling contexts. The artist, whose signature matches the faded inscription on the back, was known for experimenting with what he called spirit capture, an early and controversial attempt to photograph or paint the traces of a human soul. His methods were obscure, often dismissed as eccentric or fraudulent, but several accounts describe subjects complaining that they felt drained or ill after sitting for him. A few claimed they felt watched long after their portraits were finished. The protagonist reads these accounts late into the night, the dim light of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. Each new detail threads itself into their growing suspicion, weaving a quiet dread that presses against the back of their mind. They begin to notice odd parallels between the rumors surrounding the artist and the sensations they have been experiencing since the portrait arrived. The idea that the painting may contain more than pigment and canvas starts as an intrusive thought, one they try to reject, yet it returns again and again with increasing insistence. There is a sense of intentionality behind the sisters' gazes, something the artist might have encouraged or captured, something that did not stay dormant nearly as long as it should have. The realization begins with a faint irregularity in the paint, something the protagonist notices only because their eyes have grown attuned to every detail of the portrait. While examining the canvas one quiet evening, they catch sight of a tiny ripple beneath the left sister's eye, a distortion too subtle to be the result of age alone. At first they assume it is simply old varnish cracking, but when they brush their fingertip lightly across the surface, they feel an unevenness that suggests a second layer beneath the visible one. This discovery plants a sharp, unwelcome thought: the eyes might not be original. That possibility clings stubbornly to the edges of their mind, refusing to be dismissed, and the protagonist finds themselves examining the portrait with a precision bordering on desperation. Under the soft glow of a desk lamp, the inconsistencies become harder to ignore. The brushstrokes around the eyes are tighter and more deliberate than those on the rest of the canvas, as though a different hand, or the same hand with a very different intention, had returned years later to alter them. The skin tones around the sockets are slightly mismatched, the pigments marginally newer. These are differences no casual observer would ever notice, yet once seen, they refuse to fade. The protagonist leans closer, their breath shallow, their pulse loud in their ears, and the truth slowly unspools. Someone painted over the original eyes. Someone wanted the world to see something else in those faces. The thought brings a chill that sinks deep into their bones. They search old art restoration documents, hoping to find proof of an authorized intervention, but there is no record of the portrait ever being restored. The absence of documentation only makes the discovery more disturbing. Why would someone alter the eyes and nothing else? And what, exactly, lies beneath the newer paint? The protagonist begins to imagine the original gaze, darker, perhaps, or empty, or in some way unacceptable, silence beneath the careful strokes of whoever tried to conceal it. The notion gnaws relentlessly, turning every glance at the portrait into an invitation to look deeper, to understand what was hidden and why. Late one night, as the protagonist studies the painting yet again, they notice something even more alarming. The thin cracks in the overpainted eyes have widened ever so slightly, revealing the faintest hint of another color below, a shadowed glimmer of something older pushing it. The moment the protagonist finally witnesses the impossible does not arrive with a scream or a dramatic shatter of glass. Instead, it unfolds in the kind of quiet reserved for houses long after midnight, when every sound seems amplified and every shadow feels heavier than it should. The protagonist wakes with the distinct sensation of being observed, a feeling so sharp it drags them from sleep before they fully understand why. The house is still, the air cool, and a faint thread of moonlight spills down the hallway. They tell themselves it is nothing, just the remnants of a dream, but the awareness lingering at the back of their spine refuses to release its grip. Something is wrong. Something is waiting. Drawn by a mixture of fear and compulsion, the protagonist steps into the hallway and glances toward the room where the portrait rests. Even from a distance, they feel the weight of the sister's presence pressing through the darkness. The open doorway frames the painting in a dim glow, and although the details are softened by shadow, the eyes gleam faintly, catching the smallest trace of moonlight. The protagonist freezes, unable to convince themselves it's just a trick of the light, because the gleam shifts, very slightly, but undeniably, as though the eyes have adjusted to meet theirs. Heart pounding, they step closer, each movement deliberate and measured, as though any sudden motion might provoke the girls into doing something far worse. When they reach the edge of the room, they stop again, breath held in their throat, waiting for the stillness to reassert itself. But it doesn't. The sisters stare with an intensity that feels new, focused, unmasked. Their pupils appear deeper, darker, almost wet, reflecting the room with unnerving clarity. The protagonist tells themselves to look away, to leave, to close the door and push the portrait into the deepest corner of the attic in the morning. But something within those eyes holds them there, silent and immovable. Then, in one fragile, horrifying instant, the left sister's eyelid twitches. It's the smallest movement imaginable, no more than the faintest downward flicker, but it carries the weight of absolute certainty. The protagonist's breath stutters, their mind scrambling for any explanation, yet reason has no place left to stand. As they stare, rooted in place, the right sister's eyes shift next, the pupils constricting as though responding to the pale glow of the moon. The room contracts around them, every sound swallowed by a suffocating hush. The sisters are no longer painted figures on a canvas. They are awake, aware, and watching with a patience that suggests they have been waiting for this moment far longer than the protagonist could ever comprehend way back to the surface. It seems almost alive, as though the buried gaze is straining upward, trying to reclaim its place, trying to be seen after more than a century of enforced silence.